Welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at the Kinera BD005 Pro. So first, let me thank the HiFiGo store for sending this one out to me. If you look today on their store, it's about $49. And if we look at the title of it, you'll see sort of the first unique piece about the Kinera BD005. It's a 3D printed shell. It's a little hard to tell when shells are 3D printed versus just normal resin versus plastic. I think the 3D printed ones tend to have a little more fluidity to their shape, and a lot of them tend to include this wing as well. But this one also includes a nice little side vent and gold flecks in there as well. And each face actually says Kinera. The cable itself, this is the stock cable. It's actually quite nice, but it is a microphone-only cable. So if you are microphone phobic, feel free to replace this cable with your regular 2-pin cable. Microphone cables tend to have higher resistance values, and people tend to not use them simply for that reason, or they just have a phobia of microphone cables not sounding good. But yeah, it's a nice cable. It also comes in a very nice case, and inside that case is yet another case. So a quite nice package for $50. It's a little nicer than your average KZ cardboard box that you get for $50, but let's get into it. So second thing to notice about the Kinera BD005, it is a 1DD, 1BA, but that 1DD is actually a 9.2 millimeter beryllium coated dynamic driver, and so that's not all that common in that $50 space, so I think that is unique. But like I said in this first bullet, it's actually not base head levels of base, and it's kind of odd. It's a very nice driver, and I wish they had actually shown it off more by some increased levels of bass, but it is the way it is, and that's how they tuned it. So not a bass headset, not a treble head level of treble either. At the upper end, it's actually rolled off quite a bit, and we'll get into that in a bit. So it's sort of not at either one of those extremes. So I think they pitched this more of a general purpose. But if you're familiar with Kinera, they tend to have brighter sounding sets, and I don't think this one deviates from that brighter house sound that they typically have. So what does it sound like? It's got this slightly warm, but a very edgy, sharp, crisp, shallow V shape. But this upper mid, and let me grab the graph. So when we're looking at the graph, I think the main thing to notice is your bass level is about here, and your rise is all the way about there, and it's quite a bit of a jump there, and that really comes across in this upper mid range. It's quite bright, and that's where most of the brightness happens. And if we ignore the 8K coupler resonance right there, it's probably more down here. It definitely slopes down behind that peak as opposed to the way it looks here where there's another peak there. It's not that. So second thing to know about the graph, this is my graph. I have an IEC 711 coupler, so I will be showing my graphs and hopefully get these online for you guys in a Squid online graph database as well. So I'm sort of more excited about that than this actual graph, because it really just reinforces the fact that they needed a little more bass, or maybe just bring that down a little bit. So like I said, it's a very upper mid bright, but it's bookended by a smaller boosted bass and kind of a rolled off small boost treble. So a lot of the focus of this set happens in that mid right around the vocals area. That's really the focus of this set. So the bass, as I said, 9.2 millimeter dynamic driver. I was hoping that it was a bigger bass set. Why not show off that beryllium coated driver? But not so much. I would call it quite reserved. It could definitely use more rumble and presence to really balance out those upper mids, which are kind of way up there. So I did use an EQ low shelf, pick a number, but it definitely needs a little more presence in that lower edge. They definitely took a quality over quantity approach on the bass. It's not bad. I mean, ultimately the problem is if you're going to take that approach, you really have to highlight the quality of the bass, and I don't think by bringing it down to that level necessarily is a superstar bass. It's okay. There's some detail there and some texture, but ultimately you just think that you just need a little more as opposed to wow, what's there sounds really great. It needs a little more boost. So a track like Dead Mouse's developed this 8-minute version, jump to about 30 seconds when that beat hits, and you'll get a good point for reference on how much you want to EQ this one. It just sounded a bit hollow to me, and it really needed a lower shelf to give it a little more depth, a little more thump. And by doing that, you're going to get a little less clarity, but it's better to have a little more bass and a little less clarity in my preference anyway. But that song, the synth sounds pretty good, but it can be definitely a bit bright and fatiguing without EQ. So the mids, it's going to start off in this upper bass range, which isn't all that detailed, and then makes its way into the mids, and it becomes a lot more sharp, a lot more focused, crisp. It's very different than the bass. It's very much a clarity focused, vocal focused, right in that small range of frequency. That's where this one kind of shines. So you get this sharpness from the upper mids. It really hits you in the vocals and the strings, and it sort of gives you an edge and some detail, and that's going to appeal to some people, and some people it's going to sound awfully sharp. But coming from other sets, if you're like a blonde BL03 fan with that nice relaxed presentation, this is a little more aggressive, a little more sharp. It's kind of a nice complement to that style. And I had been listening to the KB Ear Neon prior to this, and it's kind of the same thing. That's kind of a more relaxed listen, and this one really brings the vocals in close, sharp, focused. It was actually quite nice, a nice change from the Neon. So like I said, you start out with this lesser detailed bit, then you get into sharper, detailed, intimate, close vocals, and then it kind of keeps on going up, and then it gets a bit too bright, a bit too thin, and a bit too little off natural at these higher, especially at higher volumes as you make your way through the upper mids. So the vocals are still intimate and generally staged quite nicely, and that really helps the whole presentation on the vocals. And I really got stuck on Kanye West Power, and a lot of it was because I was listening to it on the Neon, and I hated it on the Neon because Kanye's voice was so far back and recessed, and then to listen to this where Kanye is like right there, right in front of your face, and his voice is sharp and detailed, it was everything that song should be. So love that song on it, but again, you've got to really consider this. It's very intimate and transparent, but sharp and edgy. And not everyone is going to appreciate that on vocals, but on a rap like this song, it sounds really nice because of the way his voice is. So that bit is really good. Then you get to 332 in that song, and then there's the strings that just kind of get lost in the background, and that gives you a hint that these upper range instruments a little harder to track with this layering because the vocals are right there in your face, and then everything else is kind of pushed back. There isn't enough height to really get a nice separation. So great song on this. There's some weaker points to it, but as far as the vocals, that's what this set really shines on. So another really nice vocal, Tori Amos, Cornflake Girl, that 2015 remaster. First thing I noticed, the bass just wasn't as impactful as it should have been that you get on other sets. And her voice sharper than full-bodied, which goes along with this upper mid bit. And as that song continues on, it becomes fatiguing. There's almost a constant ringing in your ears, especially at higher volumes. So do consider that it's Kanye West song. There's not nearly as much upper range instruments. And then you get to Tori Amos, where it's more of a full band, and then you really get a sense of how everything plays against that upper mid peak. So do consider that. So on the treble, like I said, it starts out with this upper mid range, and then that hits the lower treble, and it's still quite high. So you're essentially going to peak out, and then behind that lower treble peak, it rolls off kind of quickly, and it becomes a little too polite. So it's kind of odd to describe treble as too polite or too bright and too polite at the same time. But yeah, this one sort of rises quickly and falls off quickly. So it does sound detailed, but everything behind that lower treble tends to fall off and it becomes harder to hear, a little too polite. It's just harder to hear, especially behind that peak. And it's almost like the Blonde Mini. Once you have a problem with a peak like that, it's very hard to hear things beyond it or even in front of it. Like in this case, the upper mids really dominate the bass that's there, and then everything beyond the upper mids at the same problem. They're sort of stuck behind all that brightness of the upper mids, and you lose a lot of those strings and cymbals that should be there in the mix, but really harder to see behind it. So detailed, but it definitely falls behind the treble. The upper treble definitely falls behind lower treble. But if you're just listening to that bit, it is a non-fatiguing, polite sound, but that sort of leads you to the point where it kind of lacks shine and sparkle because everything is being affected by that lower treble. So, but something like electric guitars sound quite sharp. It's kind of an interesting take on guitars. Cymbals, not as much. They're kind of lower in the mix, a little harder to hear. I kind of ran across Wild Side, Motley Crue's 40th anniversary remaster. So not necessarily the most natural sound. It's got a bunch of screaming guitars, which sound great. Vince Neil sounds great. So tons of fun. If you're looking for accurate natural, probably not as much, but it definitely takes on a lot of that V-shaped fun that you get on the BD005. So staging, it's got average width, and there's some depth to the vocals, but it really needs height, and this one needs height sort of in a big way to uncongest that whole midsection. If any set needed height, this one really needed, because it has such nice vocals, but those nice vocals basically block everything behind them, and it's really hard to enjoy anything but strong vocal performances for that simple reason. So yeah, this one definitely needs a bunch of height to improve imaging and layering and separation and all those things that would have happened with a bigger soundstage. So that's it. That's my take on the Kinera BD005 Pro. Again, thank you guys for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.